For the female reproductive system, you'll notice similar to the males that we are not doing the entire chapter, and so again the PowerPoint may feel a little choppy and not exactly correspond with the book, but you'll be tested over what is in the videos. So the male reproductive system is much more complex, has more purposes. Of course, does still produce and deliver gametes, but more importantly than that, it provides nutrition and a safe place for the fetal development. We give birth and nourish the infant. Also, the female system is more cyclic, and the hormones are secreted in a more complex sequence, whereas the male kind of has a constant, steady secretion. So internal organs we would expect, we know ovaries, uterine tubes, and the uterus and the vagina, and then external, the clitoris, the labia minora, and the labia majora. They occupy the perineum. So we know the primary sex organ is the ovaries, and then everything else is secondary. So the ovaries are what produce the egg cells and the sex hormones. They are almond-shaped and nestled in the ovarian fossa. They do have a capsule, just like the testes, and they have an outer cortex, and that's where the germ layers develop that are going to become egg cells. The inner medulla is where major arteries and veins are found. This talks about each egg develops in its own little follicle, lacks ducts, and then ovulation is when the follicle bursts and the egg is released. I'm not too picky about the ligaments, really, or the arteries. I feel like we've got enough going on this week. They're pretty clear, but we can take a look at the blood supply for a minute. So the aorta, and we have a branch off the ovarian artery, and then the uterine artery is where the reproductive organs are getting their blood from. Okay, so here's a sneak peek inside the structure of the ovary, and so we see those follicles at the medulla, or at the cortex, kind of along the outside, and then the medulla is where the arteries and veins are found in the middle, and then we'll take a closer look at this process of eggs forming through the process of meiosis. But we're going to kind of travel through where it starts with primary follicle, secondary follicle, mature follicle, and then finally the egg. So the uterine tube is called the oviduct or the fallopian tube. You'll see both words, so I would just get comfortable with actually all three. It's the canal that is 10 centimeters long that goes from the ovary to the uterus. This is where fertilization usually occurs of the egg and the sperm. It is lined with ciliated cells, and they are folded into longitudinal ridges. Again, here, the same as the male, you can take a look at this picture in your book. I'm more focused on the main features and not necessarily all these separate portions. Again, we're going to look at just the uterus of the uterine wall. We'll talk about that. That's where the fertilized egg is going to reside during pregnancy. It is made of mostly smooth muscle. And then this kind of talks about where there's more muscle and less muscle. But the smooth muscle is what provides labor contractions to expel the fetus. So the inner mucosa, or the endometrium, is going to be a source of study because we need to look at where the egg is. So this inner layer is simple columnar epithelium. There's tubular glands, and there's lots of leukocytes, macrophages, and other cells. So we're going to talk about which part is shed and which part isn't. So the stratum functionalis is the superficial half. It is shed each time we have a menstrual period. And then the stratum basalis is the deep layer, and that stays behind to regenerate after that outer layer is shed. For each menstrual cycle, we shed and then regenerate after that. During pregnancy, this endometrium is the site of attachment of the embryo, and it forms the maternal part of the placenta from where the fetus is nourished. Okay, so that's kind of hard to visualize, but here we go. Here is the surface epithelium within the uterine wall, and then there's the endometrial gland. So puberty starts with the first menstrual period. Teenagers need at least 17% of body fat, 22% in adults. So by having improved nutrition, that has lowered the age of that first period to about 12. Of course, this is different in different people, but that's kind of the average. The first few menstrual cycles, we don't have any eggs that are ovulated. Girls begin ovulating regularly about a year after their first period. This goes through a few other hormones that we see at puberty. Again, probably progesterone and estrogen are more important than estradiol, but progesterone is what acts on the uterus, preparing it for possible pregnancy, and then estrogens suppress FSH and LH through negative feedback. So similar to what we saw in the boys, but with different names. So inhibin is what suppresses the FSH secretion, again, just like in boys. But again, this is more cyclic, so they are all kind of timed within that menstrual cycle, and so the hormones are secreted in sequence. And then, of course, we have climacteric, which is the midlife change in the hormone secretion, and that we just call it menopause, but technically menopause is where the menstruation stops. So females are born with 2 million eggs. And then this point starts when we have about 1,000 follicles left. So that's kind of why it occurs in different ages and different women. It happens when there's 1,000 follicles left. Follicles are less responsive to the hormones at this point. Less estrogen and progesterone are secreted. And this talks about other vaginal infections can be more common, and the skin becomes thinner.